The radio inside Black Pine Fire Watchtower activated at exactly 2:14 a.m., 1 minute later than it was supposed to. I remember noticing that detail immediately because the clock above the equipment desk had stopped moving the moment the transmission began. Outside, the forest stretched endlessly beneath moonlight and drifting fog, thousands of acres of silent pine trees covering the mountains in every direction. Then the speaker crackled softly, and a man's voice whispered, "Tower 4, do not turn on the floodlights." The voice sounded distorted beneath static, but I recognized it instantly. Ranger Ellis. My supervisor. The same man I had watched leave the mountain by helicopter earlier that afternoon after reporting a family emergency in Boise. Before I could answer, another transmission came through over the same frequency. "This one is clearer. Closer. Ethan," the second voice said quietly. "Whatever you hear outside tonight, keep the lights off." Then something moved below the tower. Not near the forest line. Directly beneath the structure itself. The metal staircase attached to the side of the tower groaned softly under slow, deliberate weight, one step at a time, while the radio continued hissing static across the room. I grabbed the emergency flashlight and moved toward the northern window overlooking the stairs. Fog drifted heavily between the trees below, thick enough to hide the ground completely. But halfway down the staircase, just barely visible through the mist, someone was climbing toward the tower carrying an old forest lantern. And the floodlights outside had already turned on by themselves. 3 nights earlier. I took the Black Pine assignment because I needed somewhere quiet enough to disappear for a while. That probably sounds dramatic, but after spending nearly 6 years working in emergency wildfire response across Oregon and Northern California, silence starts to feel less like loneliness and more like recovery. My name is Ethan Cole, 34 years old. Former smoke jumper turned forestry observer after a bad leg injury grounded me permanently during a canyon fire outside Medford. Officially, I left field operations voluntarily. Unofficially, I couldn't handle another season watching people die slowly beneath smoke and heat while helicopters circled overhead waiting for weather conditions to improve. The mountains changed after that. Forests stopped feeling alive to me. They started feeling hungry. So when the State Forestry Department offered me a winter position operating Black Pine Fire Watchtower deep inside the Bitterroot Range, I accepted immediately without asking enough questions. The drive into Black Pine took nearly 5 hours through winding mountain roads buried beneath early snow. The deeper I traveled into the forest, the quieter the world became. No radio stations. No passing vehicles. Just endless pine trees stretching across frozen valleys beneath darkening skies. The tower finally appeared near sunset, standing above the forest line like a rusted needle driven into the mountain itself. 70 feet tall. Old steel supports bolted into exposed rock. A narrow staircase spiraling upward toward a small observation cabin surrounded by glass windows on every side. The place looked ancient despite still being operational, the kind of structure built decades ago when wildfire detection depended entirely on lonely men sitting above forests with binoculars and radios. Snow drifted across the mountainside around the tower while fog moved slowly between the trees below, thick enough in places to resemble smoke already rising through the woods. The previous operator was waiting for me inside the observation cabin when I finally climbed the stairs. Martin Ellis. Late 50s, maybe. Gray beard. Heavy forestry jacket zipped all the way to his throat despite the wood stove overheating the small room. He carried himself like someone who had spent too many years alone in remote places. Quiet movements, careful speech, the kind of constant alertness you only notice after enough time around wilderness workers. The cabin itself smelled like old paper, burnt coffee, pine smoke, and cold metal. Maps covered nearly every wall. Fire charts. Wind tracking systems. Emergency frequencies taped beside aging radio equipment. A narrow cot sat against the rear corner beside shelves filled with canned food and weather logs dating back almost 30 years. Ellis walked me through the normal procedures first. Weather monitoring. Night patrol frequencies. Emergency evacuation routes. Then his tone changed slightly. "There's one thing you need to understand about Black Pine," he said quietly while sliding a handwritten paper across the desk toward me. "After 2 a.m., you do not answer the radio unless dispatch identifies themselves twice." The paper contained 6 rules written in block letters. Never answer unknown transmissions after 2 a.m. Never use the floodlights unless you physically see fire. If someone appears below the tower after midnight, contact dispatch before acknowledging them. Do not respond to voices coming from the forest line during fog conditions. If the radio repeats your exact words back to you, disconnect the base unit immediately. And the final rule: if the staircase alarm activates but no one is visible outside, remain inside the cabin until sunrise. I remember reading the list twice before looking back at Ellis, expecting some kind of explanation or joke. He didn't smile. Outside, the wind pushed softly through the trees beneath the tower while snow tapped lightly against the observation windows. "How long have you worked up here?" I asked finally. Ellis stared toward the dark forest below before answering. "Long enough to stop asking why the rules exist." Before leaving the next morning, Ellis showed me the emergency generator beneath the tower and the old floodlight controls mounted near the observation windows. Then, just before the helicopter arrived to take him down the mountain, he paused near the staircase entrance and looked back toward me with an expression I still can't fully explain properly. Not fear exactly. More like exhaustion mixed with acceptance. "The radio starts around 2:10 most nights," he said quietly. "Usually, it just listens. Don't let it pull you into conversation." Then he descended the staircase without another word while fog drifted slowly between the trees below the tower. I watched him disappear into the forest beneath the steel supports until even the sound of his boots against the stairs vanished completely. And for the first time since arriving at Black Pine, I became aware of how isolated the tower actually was. Thousands of acres of frozen wilderness in every direction. No nearby roads. No visible ranger stations. Just an endless forest surrounding a single rusted structure above the trees. And somewhere deep below the tower, hidden beneath the wind moving through the pines, I thought I heard another staircase creaking softly in the dark. The first few nights at Black Pine almost convinced me the rules were nothing more than habits created by isolation. Remote forestry work changes people slowly. Spend enough months alone above endless wilderness, and eventually every strange sound starts feeling personal. I understood that better than most because wildfire crews develop the same psychology after long deployments. Silence becomes oppressive. Small noises feel amplified. Human brains hate empty environments, so they begin creating patterns where none exist. That's the explanation I kept giving myself during those early shifts in the tower. My responsibilities were simple enough. Monitor weather conditions. Track wind direction. Watch for smoke signatures or unauthorized campfires. Log radio traffic from nearby ranger stations. During winter, Black Pine mostly served as an emergency relay point in case storms damaged communications deeper in the mountains. Quiet work. Predictable work. Exactly what I thought I needed after years in active fire zones. The tower settled into routine quickly. I slept during the afternoons beneath the constant creaking of steel supports shifting in mountain wind and worked nights beside the old wood stove with weather maps spread across the desk. Outside, the forest stretched endlessly beneath moonlight and drifting fog, thousands of acres of frozen pine trees covering the valleys in every direction. Some nights, snowfall buried the mountain completely, reducing visibility so badly that the world beyond the tower windows looked like moving gray static. Other nights, the sky cleared enough for moonlight to reflect across the snowfields below, turning the forest silver beneath the wind. Around midnight, I usually made perimeter checks using binoculars and the old observation scope mounted near the eastern windows. Nothing ever moved out there. No hikers. No vehicles. No wildlife larger than the occasional elk crossing between the trees. But every night around 2:10 a.m., the radio produced the same burst of static Ellis warned me about before settling silent again. At first, that was all it did. Static. Soft enough to ignore. Then, on my fourth night, the transmission lasted longer than usual. I was updating weather logs beside the stove when the speaker crackled sharply across the room. "Tower 4, a voice whispered beneath heavy interference. "Mail. Come." Distorted enough that I couldn't identify it properly. I reached for the microphone automatically before stopping myself at the last second after remembering the rules taped beside the desk. The transmission repeated once more. "Tower 4. Confirm visual conditions." Then silence. No dispatch code. No ranger identification. Nothing. I waited several minutes before checking the emergency frequencies manually, but every channel remained empty except for low atmospheric interference drifting through the mountains. Rationally, I understood there were explanations. Weather bounce. Old equipment is catching distant frequencies from other forestry stations. But something about the timing bothered me. The voice arrived exactly at 2:13 a.m. Then the clock above the desk skipped backward by nearly 2 minutes before correcting itself. After that, smaller things began happening around the tower. The staircase alarm occasionally activated for several seconds despite nobody being visible outside. Twice, I found the floodlight switches flipped upward in the morning despite never touching them during the night. One evening, I noticed footprints circling the tower beneath fresh snowfall. Not boot prints. Bare footprints. Long narrow impressions pressed clearly into the snow around the steel support beams before disappearing near the tree line. I convinced myself they belonged to a hiker suffering from exposure or maybe distorted animal tracks partially melted during daylight. Still explainable. Still rational. But the forest itself started feeling different after midnight. Less empty. Sometimes while scanning the valleys through binoculars, I'd catch myself focusing on dark spaces between the trees with the uncomfortable certainty that something was standing there just beyond visibility. Not moving. Watching. Then the feeling would disappear the moment I lowered the binoculars again. On my sixth night, I accidentally broke one of the rules without realizing it. The radio activated around 2:11 while I was making coffee beside the stove. "Tower 4, the voice said quietly. "Do you copy?" I answered automatically before thinking. "Copy." The transmission immediately repeated my response back to me. Same cadence. Same breathing. Same voice. "Copy." I froze with the microphone still in my hand while static rolled softly through the cabin afterward. Then, somewhere below the tower, the staircase alarm activated. Slow metallic vibrations echoed upward through the steel supports beneath the floor. One step at a time. Like someone climbing carefully through the darkness below. The staircase alarm continued for nearly 30 seconds before stopping abruptly halfway up the tower. I remember standing completely motionless beside the radio desk listening to the silence afterward, trying to convince myself there had to be a rational explanation for what I'd heard. Black pine was old. The steel supports expanded and shifted constantly beneath changing temperatures. Strong winds sometimes rattled the staircase hard enough to trigger the vibration sensors mounted along the lower landings. That's what I told myself while gripping the microphone tightly enough to hurt my hand. Still, something about the pattern bothered me. The vibrations hadn't sounded random. They sounded deliberate. Slow, measured impacts spaced evenly apart like footsteps. I finally forced myself toward the western observation window overlooking the staircase and aimed my flashlight downward through the fog drifting beneath the tower. Nothing stood on the stairs. No hikers. No animals. No movement anywhere below except pine branches swaying softly in the wind. That should have been enough to calm me down. Instead, it made the situation worse. Because if someone had actually been climbing the tower, at least the sound would have belonged to something real. Tangible. Explainable. I stayed awake the rest of the night listening for more movement beneath the structure, but nothing else happened. By sunrise, exhaustion had already started reshaping the previous night into something smaller and more manageable inside my head. Sleep deprivation does that in isolated places. Fear always feels less convincing in daylight. The forest below the tower looked ordinary again beneath pale winter sunlight, endless snow-covered pines stretching peacefully through the valleys without any sign that something unnatural had moved through them hours earlier. I made coffee, updated the weather logs, and spent most of the morning rationalizing everything into categories I understood. Old equipment. Stress. Isolation. The human brain reacts badly to silence and routine. 2 nights later, another storm rolled into the mountains shortly after midnight. Thick fog moved between the trees while freezing rain rattled softly against the observation windows. Visibility dropped badly enough that the forest below the tower disappeared almost completely beyond the floodlight range. Around 2:12 a.m., the radio activated again. Tower 4, the same voice whispered beneath static. There's someone below your tower. I stared at the speaker without answering. The transmission repeated more urgently this time. Ethan, look outside. Hearing my first name made something cold settle into my stomach because forestry dispatchers don't use personal names during emergency communication unless confirming identity protocols. Before I could decide whether to respond, the staircase alarm activated beneath the cabin floor. Slow impacts echoed upward through the steel supports again. One step at a time. Higher now. Closer. Then came a second sound beneath it. Breathing. Faint but unmistakable. Wet, uneven breathing drifting upward through the fog below the tower. That's when I broke the rule. Not because I was brave. Because I was embarrassed. I'd spent years working active wildfire zones alongside people who walked directly into burning forests for a living, and now I was standing terrified inside a watchtower because of radio static and unexplained noises in the dark. I grabbed the floodlight controls near the eastern windows and switched them on. Massive beams of white light exploded across the mountainside instantly, cutting through the fog below the tower and illuminating the forest in harsh sweeping arcs. At first, I saw nothing except trees and drifting mist. Then the lights reached the staircase. Someone was standing halfway up the tower looking directly toward the cabin windows. The figure wore old forestry gear darkened by moisture and age, a heavy jacket hanging unnaturally loose around its body, while one hand rested motionless against the stair railing. Even from 70 feet above, I could see there was something wrong with the proportions of its face. The features looked almost human from a distance, but stretched slightly out of alignment like someone trying to imitate a person from memory instead of understanding how human expressions actually worked. The figure didn't react to the floodlights, didn't shield its eyes, didn't move at all. It simply remained standing there in the full glare of the tower lights while fog drifted slowly around the staircase beneath it. Then the radio crackled beside me. "You weren't supposed to turn the lights on," my own voice whispered through the speaker. I turned instinctively toward the desk, and when I looked back toward the staircase, the figure was gone. Not descending. Not hidden by fog. Gone completely. But the staircase alarm was still vibrating beneath the floorboards. And this time, the footsteps sounded like they were directly underneath the observation cabin itself. After the floodlights incident, Black Pine stopped feeling like an observation tower and started feeling like a trap suspended above the forest. The change wasn't immediate or dramatic. It happened slowly through details small enough to question individually but impossible to ignore together. The radioactivity increased first. Every night after 2 a.m., transmissions began slipping through the static more frequently, sometimes using dispatch terminology, sometimes speaking in calm conversational tones that sounded disturbingly familiar. Once, I heard my old wildfire captain asking if I could still smell smoke. Another night, the speaker produced my younger brother's voice despite the fact that we hadn't spoken in almost 4 years. The worst transmissions were the quiet ones. Breathing. Soft movement beneath static. Occasional whispering too distorted to understand clearly. I stopped responding entirely after that, but the tower somehow felt more aware of my silence, as if ignoring the radio only encouraged whatever used it to keep trying. The staircase alarm became almost routine. Some nights, it activated once around 2:13 before stopping abruptly halfway up the tower. Other nights, the vibrations continued for several minutes. Slow metallic impacts echoing through the steel supports beneath the cabin floor while fog drifted heavily below the windows. I never turned the floodlights on again after the first encounter. That became my own rule. No matter what happened beneath the tower, the lights stayed off. But avoiding the staircase only made me notice other things instead. The tower sometimes creaked under the weight when there was no wind. The old binoculars near the eastern window occasionally shifted position on their own between patrol checks. Twice, I woke during the afternoon, convinced someone had walked slowly around the outside observation deck while I slept. Both times, I found wet footprints circling the tower afterward, despite temperatures cold enough to freeze exposed skin solid within minutes. 3 nights after I used the floodlights, the weather turned unnaturally warm for nearly 6 hours. Snow melted from sections of the mountain despite it being the middle of January, and thick fog swallowed the valleys so completely that the forest disappeared beneath a moving white ocean below the tower. Around 2:11 a.m., every radio frequency activated simultaneously. Dispatch chatter. Emergency weather alerts. Distorted ranger communications layered over each other through overlapping static. Beneath the noise, I heard something else moving through the transmission, low rhythmic clicking that resembled footsteps echoing across metal stairs. Then one voice cut clearly through the others. "Tower 4, it whispered. "There's a fire below you." Instinct took over before logic could stop me. I moved toward the southern windows and looked down into the fog beneath the tower. At first, I saw nothing except drifting white mist moving slowly between the trees. Then the orange light flickered deep below the forest line. Small at first. Distant. Like embers glowing beneath heavy smoke. I grabbed the binoculars immediately. The moment I focused them toward the light, my stomach dropped. There was no fire. The orange glow came from dozens of old forest lanterns hanging motionless between the trees beneath the tower. They stretched through the fog in long uneven rows disappearing deep into the forest, pale yellow flames swaying softly in complete silence. And standing among them were figures. Not moving. Not speaking. Just watching the tower through the fog while the lantern light illuminated their outlines beneath the trees. Some wore forestry jackets. Others looked like hikers or rangers. A few appeared too distorted to identify properly at all. Then I noticed something even worse. The lanterns weren't spread randomly through the forest. They formed a trail leading directly toward the staircase below the tower. At that exact moment, the staircase alarm activated again beneath the cabin floor. Slow, deliberate impacts echoed upward through the steel supports while the radio whispered beside me in Martin Ellis's voice, "Don't let them reach the door." 3 nights after I used the floodlights, the weather turned unnaturally warm for nearly 6 hours. Snow melted from sections of the mountain despite it being the middle of January, and thick fog swallowed the valleys so completely that the forest disappeared beneath a moving white ocean below the tower. Around 2:11 a.m., every radio frequency activated simultaneously. Dispatch chatter. Emergency weather alerts. Distorted ranger communications layered over each other through overlapping static. Beneath the noise, I heard something else moving through the transmission, low rhythmic clicking that resembled footsteps echoing across metal stairs. Then one voice cut clearly through the others. "Tower 4, it whispered. "There's a fire below you." Instinct took over before logic could stop me. I moved toward the southern windows and looked down into the fog beneath the tower. At first, I saw nothing except drifting white mist moving slowly between the trees. Then the orange light flickered deep below the forest line. Small at first. Distant. Like embers glowing beneath heavy smoke. I grabbed the binoculars immediately. The moment I focused them toward the light, my stomach dropped. There was no fire. The orange glow came from dozens of old forest lanterns hanging motionless between the trees beneath the tower. They stretched through the fog in long uneven rows disappearing deep into the forest, pale yellow flames swaying softly in complete silence. And standing among them were figures. Not moving. Not speaking. Just watching the tower through the fog while the lantern light illuminated their outlines beneath the trees. Some wore forestry jackets. Others looked like hikers or rangers. A few appeared too distorted to identify properly at all. Then I noticed something even worse. The lanterns weren't spread randomly through the forest. They formed a trail leading directly toward the staircase below the tower. At that exact moment, the staircase alarm activated again beneath the cabin floor. Slow, deliberate impacts echoed upward through the steel supports while the radio whispered beside me in Martin Ellis's voice, "Don't let them reach the door." The next morning, I searched the entire tower looking for anything Ellis might have left behind. Until then, I'd treated the rules like survival habits created by years of isolation, but the lanterns in the forest changed that completely. Hallucinations don't organize themselves into patterns. Fear doesn't synchronize radio frequencies or trigger mechanical alarms with perfect timing. Something at Black Pine followed procedures. Systems. That realization unsettled me more than the figures themselves because it suggested intelligence instead of randomness. I spent most of the afternoon going through old storage cabinets beneath the weather desk until I found a locked metal drawer hidden behind decades of forestry reports. The key was taped beneath the radio console. Inside were maintenance logs, missing person records, and handwritten notebooks dating back nearly 40 years. Almost every document referenced the same thing in a different language. Unknown radioactivity after 2 a.m. unexplained staircase alarms. Rangers report voices in the forest during heavy fog conditions. Several pages mentioned the climb, as though everyone stationed at Black Pine eventually understood what the phrase meant without needing explanation. One report from 1987 described a winter observer named Daniel Hurst who disappeared during a snowstorm after responding to a late-night transmission requesting emergency evacuation. According to the records, nearby ranger stations never sent the call. Search crews found the tower empty the next morning with the floodlights still active and the staircase door standing open despite severe weather outside. Another report, dated 12 years later, described a temporary operator who suffered severe psychological collapse after claiming the people in the fog knew personal details they shouldn't know. The pages became increasingly fragmented the newer they got, as though later observers stopped writing formal reports and started leaving warnings instead. Never answer familiar voices. Never confirm names over the radio after 2 a.m. If the staircase alarm reaches the final landing, do not open the cabin door, no matter who speaks outside. Every note carried the same exhausted tone beneath the wording. Not panic, not confusion, but the gradual acceptance of something impossible becoming routine through repetition. Near the bottom of the drawer, I found Martin Ellis's notebook. Most of it contained ordinary forestry observations. Weather patterns, maintenance schedules, wildfire reports from previous seasons. Then the writing changed abruptly about halfway through. Entire pages focused on radioactivity and nighttime incidents around the tower. It imitates recognition first. The voices become more accurate over time. The fog hides movement until acknowledgement occurs. One entry dated 7 months earlier described Ellis seeing lanterns beneath the tower for the first time during late winter storms. Another mentioned hearing his dead wife's voice over emergency frequencies despite her having died nearly a decade earlier. But the final pages disturbed me most because Ellis stopped writing like a forestry worker entirely. The entries became fragmented, paranoid, and almost desperate. It climbs because someone invited it once. The staircase isn't for entering the tower. The lights show where to stop. Then, near the final page, I found a sentence underlined repeatedly hard enough to tear the paper beneath it. If it reaches the cabin, it asks to be recognized. That night, I finally understood why Black Pine had remained operational despite decades of incidents nobody officially acknowledged. The tower wasn't monitoring wildfires anymore. It was monitoring whatever existed in the forest below after midnight. Around 2:10 a.m., the radio activated again while thick fog drifted through the valleys beneath the observation windows. This time, the voice belonged to my mother. She died from cancer 8 years ago. "Ethan," she whispered through the speaker, "please answer me." Every muscle in my body locked instantly because the voice was perfect. Not similar. Exact. Same tired softness. Same breathing pattern between words. Then the staircase alarm activated beneath the floor. Slow metallic impacts echoed one step at a time upward while the radio continued speaking quietly. "You left me alone in the hospital," my mother's voice whispered. "I just want to see you again." I backed away from the desk hard enough to knock over the chair beside me while the footsteps beneath the tower continued climbing steadily through the fog below. Then came the final impact. The top landing. Directly outside the cabin door. The knocking started almost immediately after the footsteps reached the top landing. 3 slow impacts against the cabin door. Not violent. Not desperate. Controlled enough to sound human. I stood frozen near the radio desk listening while the fog pressed heavily against the observation windows around the tower. Then my mother's voice spoke again from the other side of the door. "Ethan," it whispered, "open the door before the fog gets worse." Every instinct in my body screamed at me to answer. That was the worst part of whatever existed below Black Pine. It didn't rely on fear alone. It used familiarity, regret, memory. The voice outside sounded exhausted the same way my mother did during her final weeks in hospice, weak enough that for one horrifying second I almost forgot she had been dead for nearly a decade. Then the staircase alarm suddenly stopped vibrating beneath the floor. Complete silence settled across the tower afterward, thick enough that I could hear the wood stove crackling softly behind me. I never opened the door that night. The voice continued for nearly 20 minutes before fading back into the static drifting through the radio speakers. By sunrise, something inside me had changed permanently. Up until then, I'd still been trying to explain Black Pine through logic and stress and isolation. After hearing my mother's voice outside the cabin, I stopped searching for rational explanations entirely. Instead, I started studying patterns. The thing below the tower behaved consistently enough to predict if you paid attention carefully. It never approached before 2 a.m. The fog always arrived first. The voices became more personal only after acknowledgement occurred. Most importantly, the staircase alarm followed progression. Lower landings meant observation. Middle landings meant communication. The top landing meant an invitation. Once I understood that, I stopped treating the rules like folklore and started treating them like survival procedures. I created my own rules after that. Never listen to radio transmissions with the lights off. Never look directly into the fog for longer than a few seconds if lanterns become visible. If the staircase alarm activates after 2:13, remain seated away from the door until sunrise, no matter what voice speaks outside. I also disconnected the external floodlights completely by removing their power fuses from the generator beneath the tower. That became the most important rule of all. No lights after midnight under any circumstances. The floodlights didn't scare the thing away. They guided it. Ellis had understood that before leaving Black Pine, and now I finally understood it too. The tower itself was part of the system somehow. The radios, the staircase alarms, the floodlights. Everything functioned like an invitation mechanism waiting for the correct sequence of acknowledgement to occur. The disturbances became more aggressive once I stopped responding. The radio activated almost constantly now between 2 and 3 a.m., cycling through voices from different periods of my life with terrifying accuracy. Old Wildfire crew members. My brother. My ex-girlfriend from Portland. Sometimes my own voice spoke softly from empty frequencies while the staircase alarm vibrated below the tower. One night, the observation windows fogged from the outside despite temperatures far below freezing, and words slowly appeared across the glass as if traced by invisible fingers moving through condensation. Let us in. Another night, I woke during the afternoon to find muddy footprints circling the inside of the observation deck outside the cabin windows despite the staircase entrance remaining locked from within. But the worst incidents happened during silence. Sometimes, around 2:20, everything would stop at once. No wind. No radio static. No movement from the forest below. In those moments, the tower felt less like an observation station and more like something waiting patiently above the trees, with me trapped inside it. Then, 6 nights after the knocking incident, the radio activated with Martin Ellis's voice again. "Ethan," he whispered calmly through the speaker, "they've started climbing before the fog arrives." My stomach dropped instantly because the staircase alarm beneath the floor hadn't activated yet. For several seconds, I sat completely motionless, listening to the transmission while snow drifted quietly beyond the windows. Then came the first metallic impact from somewhere far below the tower. Slow. Deliberate. One step at a time, climbing upward through darkness. But outside, the forest remained clear beneath the moonlight. No fog. No lanterns. Nothing is hiding the staircase from view anymore. And halfway down the tower, illuminated clearly beneath the pale snowlight, at least 7 figures were already climbing toward the cabin together. The figures moved in complete silence. That's the detail I remember most clearly. 7 people climbing a 70-foot metal staircase in the middle of the night should have produced noise. Boots against steel, breathing, movement through the railings. But the only sound echoing through the tower came from the staircase alarm vibrating beneath the floorboards, one landing at a time. I stood frozen beside the observation windows, watching them emerge slowly from the darkness below, while pale moonlight reflected across the snow-covered forest surrounding the tower. Some of the figures wore old forestry jackets. Others looked like hikers dressed for winter weather, decades out of date. One appeared barefoot despite the mountain being buried beneath ice and snow. Their faces remained impossible to focus on properly, even through binoculars, features shifting subtly whenever I tried concentrating too hard on any one of them. But every figure climbed with the same slow, synchronized pace, heads tilted upward toward the observation cabin as though they already knew I was watching. The radio activated moments later. Not static this time. Clean transmission. "Tower 4, dispatch said calmly. "We received your emergency flare request." My stomach dropped immediately because I hadn't contacted dispatch all night. Before I could answer, another voice interrupted across the same frequency. "Martin Ellis." "Don't respond," he whispered sharply. "It's using the tower system now." The transmission distorted violently afterward, dissolving into overlapping voices speaking over one another through bursts of static. I heard my own name repeated dozens of times beneath the interference, while the staircase alarm beneath the floor continued vibrating steadily upward. 5th landing. 6th. 7th. Then every radio inside the cabin activated simultaneously. Emergency weather channels. Forestry frequencies. Ranger communications. All broadcasting the same sentence in different voices. "Please acknowledge arrival." Outside, the figures continued climbing toward the tower without ever once looking away from the cabin windows. That's when the floodlights turned on. I had removed the power fuses myself nearly a week earlier. I knew they couldn't function. Yet massive beams of white light exploded across the mountainside beneath the tower, illuminating the staircase and forest with brutal clarity. The figures stopped climbing immediately. For the first time since appearing below the tower, they reacted. Slowly, every head turned toward the lights surrounding them. And in that instant, I finally saw what they actually looked like. Their bodies resembled people only from a distance. Up close, the proportions were subtly wrong everywhere. Arms slightly too long, mouth stretching wider than natural human anatomy allowed, eyes reflecting light without blinking. Several faces looked unfinished somehow, features arranged incorrectly like distorted copies assembled from incomplete memory. Then the tallest figure nearest the center of the staircase slowly raised one hand toward the cabin windows. And every floodlight surrounding the tower shattered at once. Darkness slammed across the mountain instantly. The staircase alarm reached the top landing seconds later. Heavy impacts shook the steel supports directly beneath the cabin floor while something moved slowly across the outside observation deck surrounding the tower. Not one thing. Multiple. Wet footsteps circled the windows in deliberate patterns while the radio screamed with overlapping voices loud enough to distort the speakers completely. "Tower 4 acknowledges arrival. Open the door. You invited us upward. We remember the fire." That last sentence froze me instantly because nobody outside the wildfire response knew what happened during the Medford Canyon incident. The official investigation sealed most of the details after the burnover killed 3 smoke jumpers trapped below the ridge line. But the voices kept speaking through the radios anyway, calmly repeating details only survivors should have known. Then came a soft knock against the cabin door. Not desperate anymore. Patient. Familiar. My younger brother's voice spoke from the other side quietly enough that I almost missed it beneath the static. "Ethan," he whispered, "why did you leave me alone with Dad after Mom died?" I backed away from the door so quickly that I nearly fell against the weather desk because that wasn't public information. I had never told anyone that story in my life. Then the observation windows started fogging from the outside again. Slowly, deliberately, shapes moved behind the condensation circling the tower while invisible fingers traced words across the glass one letter at a time. "You already know US." The radio systems died completely after that, plunging the cabin into silence except for movement outside the walls. I remember standing there beneath the dim emergency lantern beside the stove, realizing something horrifying all at once. The thing below Black Pine didn't imitate dead people randomly. It learned through recognition. Every answered transmission. Every moment of fear. Every memory I reacted to gave it more accuracy. More access. The rules were never meant to stop something from entering the tower. They were meant to stop the tower from teaching it how to become human enough to be invited inside willingly. And outside the cabin door, something wearing my brother's voice began laughing softly in the dark. The laughing outside the cabin door continued for nearly a minute before stopping abruptly. Not fading. Stopping. Complete silence swallowed the tower afterward while snow drifted softly against the observation windows and condensation slowly crawled across the glass from the outside. I remember standing motionless beside the stove, gripping the emergency flare gun so tightly my hand cramped, trying to control my breathing while something circled slowly around the observation deck outside. The footsteps no longer sounded human. Too uneven. Too heavy in some places, almost weightless in others. Then the cabin door handle moved gently for the first time. Not shaking violently or forcing itself inward. Testing. Like whoever stood outside expected the lock to open eventually on its own. That was the moment I finally understood something important about Black Pine. The thing below the tower wasn't trying to break in. It had never been. It was waiting for permission. Everything about the rules, the radio transmissions, the voices, the staircase, even the floodlights, revolved around acknowledgement. Recognition created access. Fear created familiarity. And familiarity eventually became invitation. Then I noticed the emergency signal map hanging beside the weather desk. Black Pine wasn't the only tower marked in the forest. Dozens of old observation stations once operated across the Bitterroot Range decades earlier, before satellite surveillance replaced most human lookout systems. Nearly all of them were abandoned now, except for a few winter relay points still maintained by the Forestry Department. But one symbol near the northern ridgeline caught my attention immediately. Tower 8. Decommissioned 23 years earlier after a structural collapse during wildfire season. According to the maintenance notes beside the map, the emergency communication line is still connected remotely to Black Pine through underground relay wiring beneath the mountains. Ellis had circled the location repeatedly in red ink. Beneath it, he'd written a single sentence. It started after Tower 8 burned. My stomach dropped instantly because the Medford fire years earlier had taught me something most people never understand about wildfire behavior. Fire changes landscapes permanently. Not just physically. Psychologically. Entire regions carry memory afterward. And suddenly, the voices at Black Pine stopped feeling random anymore. They sounded like echoes trapped inside something old enough to keep replaying them. Outside, the footsteps stopped moving. Then my own voice spoke from the other side of the cabin door. "Ethan," it whispered calmly, "you know how this ends." The accuracy terrified me more than any previous imitation because it wasn't copying words I'd spoken aloud before. It was using my internal cadence. The exact tone my thoughts used when I talked to myself during sleepless nights after the canyon fire. For several seconds, I couldn't move at all. Then something else occurred to me. Every escalation at Black Pine happened through the tower systems themselves. Radios, floodlights, staircase alarms, communication infrastructure. The tower wasn't protecting observers from the thing in the forest. It was feeding it information, teaching them identities through repeated interaction over decades. Which meant as long as Black Pine remained operational, the cycle would continue forever. I moved toward the generator controls beneath the floor hatch near the rear wall while the voice outside the door continued speaking softly in my tone. "Don't do this," it whispered. "You'll leave them alone in the dark again." My hand shook violently while unlocking the hatch because part of me genuinely believed something terrible would happen if the tower lost power completely. But another part finally understood that the tower itself was the reason the thing could climb at all. The generator room beneath the cabin was cold and smelled like diesel fuel, rust, and wet concrete. The staircase alarm vibrated violently through the steel supports around me while movement continued above on the observation deck overhead. I found the main relay controls near the fuel tanks, exactly where Ellis described them during my first day at Black Pine. Emergency communications, floodlight systems, staircase monitoring. One primary breaker powered the entire tower network. I hesitated only briefly before pulling the lever downward. The effect was immediate. Every light inside Black Pine died simultaneously. The staircase alarm stopped mid-vibration. The radios fell silent. Even the wind outside seemed to vanish for half a second beneath the sudden darkness. Then something screamed above the cabin. Not human. Not an animal. A sound so distorted and layered it resembled dozens of voices tearing apart at once. The steel tower shook violently around me while heavy impacts slammed against the observation deck overhead, hard enough to send rust drifting from the ceiling beams. Then came the final realization that still keeps me awake some nights. The screaming wasn't coming from outside the tower anymore. It was coming from inside the radio room directly above me. I don't remember climbing back into the radio room. Most of that final night exists in fragments now. Darkness, freezing air, the smell of burnt wiring somewhere inside the walls. The emergency lantern I carried barely illuminated the cabin after the generator shut down, leaving most of the observation room buried beneath deep, moving shadows. But I remember the silence most clearly. The radios were dead. The staircase alarm had stopped. Even the wind outside seemed distant now, muffled beneath the weight of whatever had screamed above me after the power failed. The cabin looked abandoned in the lantern light. Frost is spreading slowly across the windows. Weather maps fluttering softly near the desk. One of the observation chairs was overturned beside the northern glass wall. Then I noticed the cabin door standing partially open. Just a few inches. I knew with absolute certainty I had locked it before climbing down into the generator room. Outside the door, the observation deck was empty. Snow covered the metal walkway surrounding the tower in smooth, untouched layers beneath moonlight. No footprints. No movement. The forest below Black Pine stretched silently through the mountains like nothing had ever climbed from it at all. I stood there for several minutes trying to convince myself that the nightmare had ended with the generator shutdown. Maybe the tower systems really had been malfunctioning. Maybe isolation and exhaustion pushed my mind further than I realized. Human beings can rationalize almost anything once daylight approaches closely enough. Then I noticed the staircase. Fresh wet footprints circled upward from the darkness below the tower and stopped directly outside the cabin entrance. Not leaving the tower. Entering it. Long, narrow impressions pressed into melting snow like bare human feet exposed to freezing rain. And beside the final footprint near the doorway sat an old forest lantern still burning with pale yellow light despite the wind. Forestry officials evacuated Black Pine 3 days later after I reported catastrophic electrical failure inside the tower systems. Officially, the station closed because winter storms damaged the communication relays beyond repair. Unofficially, nobody argued when I insisted the tower should never reopen again. The recovery crews avoided staying near the staircase after sunset, and one maintenance worker reportedly quit after hearing voices over emergency frequencies despite every radio inside the tower remaining disconnected from power. Nobody mentioned the footprints I photographed outside the cabin door. Nobody asked why the floodlights had exploded outward instead of burning out normally. Most disturbing of all, nobody seemed surprised when I told them the radios became active after 2 a.m. One forestry supervisor simply stared toward the mountains for several seconds before quietly asking me whether the voices had used people I recognized personally. When I said yes, he nodded like someone hearing confirmation of a story already passed quietly through enough departments over enough years. I left Montana after that and never returned to wildfire work again. For a while I convinced myself that distance would eventually make Black Pine feel rational. Sleep deprivation. Trauma. Isolation layered over unresolved guilt from Medford. But certain details refused to fit inside any explanation I created. 2 months after leaving the tower, I received a package with no return address containing only a single photograph. Black Pine Fire Watchtower during winter sometime in the late 1970s. Several forestry observers stood outside near the staircase, smiling toward the camera beneath heavy snowfall. And near the edge of the image, partially hidden among the trees below the tower, stood another figure holding a lantern. The photograph quality was poor, but the face remained clear enough for me to recognize immediately. It was me. Same winter jacket. Same scar across my jaw from the canyon fire years later. Standing motionless beneath the trees decades before I ever arrived at Black Pine. I barely sleep now. Most nights, I wake around 2:13 a.m. with the same overwhelming feeling that something is standing just outside my apartment door listening quietly through the silence. Sometimes I hear faint radio static drifting from rooms where no electronics are running. Other nights, I dream about the tower itself still standing above the forest beneath endless fog, while lanterns move slowly between the trees below. But the worst nights are when I hear the staircase. Slow metallic impacts echo upward one step at a time somewhere deep inside the building where I live now. Always stopping just outside my floor before sunrise arrives. And every once in a while, right before I fall asleep again, the darkness near my bedroom door whispers in my own voice. "Tower 4, it says calmly. Please acknowledge arrival."